Welcome back to Procedural Systems for Production in Cinema 4D. In this final lesson, we'll be covering finessing and finishing our shot, and we'll continue our development of our motion test by building out some additional subsystems that we'll need for padding layers and the stitching patterns to overlay on top. We'll briefly cover approach to look development and texturing and lighting, and then cover finalizing the shot with some micro details and some nice final touches to really bring it across the finish line. And then we'll close with some final thoughts and philosophies on the project as a whole and how to kind of move forward from our initial shot and maybe revisiting some style frames to develop further and really round out our project as a whole. So let's dive in to our motion test, see where it's at, and continue our development there. All right, and here we are where we left off from the last lesson. We have our base system set up here, and we can start layering on some additional subsystems. And usually my approach with developing shots like this is, trying to get the bones worked out and then kind of fleshing it out from there. So making sure that, our initial setup is working the way that we like it, and then now kind of getting more into the minutia of developing this and pushing it towards a direction that we're happy with. So currently we have our center fragile sphere that's being cradled by the cushioning as it travels along, and that center sphere traveling is actually driving the X-ray kind of cutaway to reveal the inner cushioning and the inner workings. And now that we have this cutaway, I want to start adding some layering onto the center so it really feels like the center sphere is being supported and cushioned as much as possible, and really can drive home some of the asks and benefits from the client as well at the same time. So let's start diving that out. So we have our initial rig here, and we want to add some padding just on this center portion. So what we can do is, due to our smart use of hierarchy, we have all these blown out, so we can choose kind of which level we need to instance. And actually for this one, I just need this entire thing, so we can actually just instance this main rig here. So just gonna grab an instance of that. And you can see here, let's just change the color so we know what we're working with. We just have a second version of it, second instance, just layered on here. So what I want to do first is, again, explode this out. So this will be kind of similar to some of the techniques that we've used thus far. And we're going to want to explode out all these polygons so we can individually affect them. So you can grab a poly effects and make that a child. Let's throw this all into a null, hitting Alt-G to throw those things that are selected into a group. And this will be, we'll just call this padding for now. And I need to grab this poly effects, and we'll just grab another plane effector. It's going to go all crazy because it's not doing what we want. We want to dive into the parameters here and turn off position. Don't need that. I'm just going to scale these down slightly, maybe by negative 0.3. So now we're getting just a shrink down version of each polygon within there, and we can start working with that here. So that'll be this initial one. We can just call this initial plane effector. We can just call maybe like shaper, because it's actually shaping each individual polygon. And we want to grab another one here. Again, turn off position, and for scale, we'll set this one to -1. And this one will be actually, we can just call it driver for now, because it's actually going to be what drives just this center portion as the sphere travels along. So if I just get rid of all those for a second, we can hit play on this. You can see as this travels along, we want this kind of center portion where it's being cradled nicely here. I'm actually going to turn off the upper layer cloth as well. It doesn't look too great, not in render, because that black and white flashing is kind of distracting. So I just want kind of a perimeter or radius around here that can be our padding that supports our sphere. So if we go back, let's re-enable this. And for our driver here, we're going to use our trusty main driver, our sphere. We'll grab that, and we're going to set this to a certain distance. We actually want to go under remapping and invert this because we want it to actually, only grow the center portions. And for our remapping, we don't want too much of a offset there. And you can even come in here and tweak our curve a little bit. You can always play with those later. And let's go into our actual form, and we can expand this how we'd like. I think just like here and that outer edge along here could work pretty good. So as this travels along, it's just selecting some of these paddings here. So we have those polygons selected, and we actually want to now extrude those so we can start to get an actual padding shape. So let's do that. We can grab this, and we'll actually just toss it into our stack here. We need to set our extrusion steps to 1, and we don't want that much of extrusion. We could probably just do just a little bit here, and just get a nice little bit of thickness across the board. So we have this now, and perhaps we want to, as we're working on this development, we want to showcase some more material changes across the board. So I particularly wanted, when working on the shot, to have an outer padding and then an inner padding, and we could have separate materials for each of those. So what we can do is perhaps this is padding outer, and we can just select these outer edge and then do the inverse for the rest of it and get a nice variation between our different types of padding, and even have different materials for each of the types of padding. So let's do that now. So we can just copy this driver here, and this one I'm actually going to change to add, and that'll allow us to subtract out some of this here. And let's go back. Yeah. We want to invert this. So now our selection is, from the inner, and then this one is being added on top, blending onto the lower layer. So as we kind of scale this, we can subtract out those center ones. And actually this remapping maybe even do a harder edge, even more so on this one as well. And this one, I actually want to scale down a little bit. Looks pretty good. And so now as this travels along, it will, just select these outer edge of the polygons there. So that'll be our outer padding. We can just duplicate this, and we can name this one inner padding, padding inner. And for this one, I'm actually going to change this color real quick just to make sure we know what we're doing. Just set it to red. And for this one, we are going to get rid of this driver. And for this blending mode, we'll just change it to normal. And we want to go into remapping here and invert that. And now we get our inner selection from the same radius. And we can even link the radius of both of these, just so if we need to tweak these down the line, they are affecting one another. But now we have inner selection of padding and an outer selection of padding, which is perfect for what we need. And as we're kind of going along here, we can just kind of cancel those out and be smart about our kind of limited viewport capacity here within Cinema. So we have our padding now set up. Let's do the old cooking show technique, and we'll jump into a kind of pre-baked one. All right, so here we are in the next iteration of the same setup. I just took some time here to dial in our padding to get the look that I was going for specifically. And at this point, I want to start introducing some of the stitching patterns that we did development work on earlier, and start to get some nice stitching patterns along the revealed inner cushion here. So what we can do to start doing that, we're going to use pretty much the same techniques that we developed and worked on in earlier lessons, but we can grab a instance of our base geo here. We actually don't want even this one that has the bevel. We're going to form our own patterns with some new beveling. So we want to just grab this this base one here that only has the displacement happening for the center. So if I grab this here, maybe we change the color again just so we can see it easier. Blue, maybe it'll work. Cool. And what we want to do is start to create our own pattern here. So maybe we will grab this and just bump it up a little bit for now, just so we can see it easier. And I'm going to turn on line shading so we can see that as well. And we'll add our first bevel in. We're going to add a handful of these just to create a specific pattern. And obviously this takes some time as well to kind of tweak and play around with and get the specific look you're going for. I generally have an idea of the type of pattern that I want based on some of the previous style frames and some initial development work. So I'm going to, for this first bevel, we're just going to bevel from each edge and just bevel that out by 8 centimeters. We'll keep it to a fixed distance just so it's fixed across each edge. We're going to copy this one out. And for this one, we're actually going to do point bevel instead. And we can keep this as at fixed distance. We just want to dial this down a little bit, perhaps to 5. I'm just trying to, within each of these sub-squares here, is get, just hide that so we can see a little bit clear, and dive out of my camera, is just get a, within each one of those squares is get a nice inner padding there, or inner pattern, sorry. So after that, I want to then get some detail on each of those edges. So I'll copy this one again, set it back to edges, and we can start to get a pattern here. We want to generally, these will descend in value. So you want to bevel from your highest amount here. I set this specifically just to remain within those initial squares that we have from the primary rig, if you can see here, just to accentuate and be complementary to the underlying structure. And then from there, you essentially want to descend in values, because if you exceed the previous value, you end up beveling outside of that edge or that point, and you get some less than ideal values there. So we'll descend in value here. So go down to 2. 2 is probably good. And I'm actually going to up our subdivisions here for this one, so we can start to get some of that nice threading there. And we can start to get a pattern on those edges. So what I'm going to do here, actually throw this all within a atom array. And we can throw that in there. And we just need to dial this in. Let's see, we can try. Actually don't want any of the sphere radius. So if we set these the same, we can essentially just get the stitching there, and starting to look pretty good. I think I'm going to drop this subdivision down one. There we go. And essentially there we can start to get our stitching pattern referencing the same base geo. But what I wanted to do here is I actually wanted some like beading within each of these sections here. So if, this is our kind of main stitching, and then we have some nice like accent beading for each of these subsections here. So what we can do is we'll just actually copy out this system, collapse these down just to clean up our viewport here. And we are going to, for this one, we can get rid of these bevels. And I want to set this sphere radius higher. So maybe, I think 2 is too big, but maybe like 1.5. Just get those beads there. And then for our cylinder radius, we'll make it just negligible of a value. So you're not able to really see that inner stitching there. And since we use the same, base bevel from this one here, we just get these perfectly in the center of each of those, which works out nicely. We could even, expand, not that one there, this one here, to kind of give some spacing around each of the spheres. But now we have our stitching with some nice beading along as well. And again, this is just kind of a very iterative and tinkering type process that takes some time to get specifically what you're looking for, and that's kind of the fun of it, is just playing around and exploring and seeing what discoveries you can make along the way. So we'll kind of, just to keep things moving along, dive in again to a scene file with all of these values dialed in specifically where we'd like them, and we can move on from there. So let's jump into that quickly. And here we have a later iteration of our shot. And this is after, our motion and our animation was all netted out and the overall systems were in a good place. And from there, starting to dive into look development for the scene. And I think primarily the main thing to keep in mind before moving on to look development is just having a very clear understanding of what you're looking to achieve and the overall direction that you're looking to capture with your lighting and with your texturing. It's really a case of trying to understand the feeling that you're looking to evoke, and being really clear and considerate. So for this specifically, we can see from our last scene, just started to dial in some of the systems themselves. So we have essentially the same setup, but just started to tweak that to get it into a more kind of cohesive space where everything is working better together. So we can fire up our render here and start to take a look at what we have. So let's take a look at what we have here. Across the board, we're using Grayscale Gorilla materials and HDRIs and area light maps, also even using some of their dust. And just to primarily keep it all within the family, but then also to avoid any legality issues in terms of making these scene files available to you guys. So I made use of a lot of the everyday materials from GSG, and those give us a great kind of jump start on a lot of our materials. So for the base cushioning here, let's actually turn off some of these other elements, and we can kind of take a look at them one at a time. So get rid of our cushions, we'll get rid of our outer layer cloth, and even get rid of our stitching here as well. All right, so taking a look at our base material here, you can see if I open up our main fabric, I'm using two different materials from GSG and kind of tweaking those to my specific needs. Especially for a lot of this really kind of macro, tangible, and tactile detail, which oftentimes is the specific look that I'm going for in terms of trying to make it feel photographic, trying to make it feel really real world, and you're able to kind of reach out and touch it in a lot of cases. We can use these materials. Chad did a great job with these as our base, and then I began to kind of add in some additional maps, which primarily included some additional grunge imperfections and bump maps to just really break up the space here and just breaks up the uniformity across the board. From there, I created just a couple simple different graphic patterns that I was experimenting with. The simple dot pattern ended up working the best for my use case, and using that to blend between the different materials. I think again with the look direction I was going for, some of this dust is kind of getting in our way. We'll close this out. Adding in those additional maps really just help a lot in terms of making it feel tactile and making it feel like a manufactured material with some like quality imperfections along the way. So from there, let's dive into our overlaying cloth. We can turn this on and have a look. Let's dive back into our camera quickly. And for the outer cloth here, essentially just grabbed a cloth material from the GSG Everyday Materials collection and tweak that a little bit to my specific kind of color space and color palette I was going for. And we're essentially using the same setup as before and just driving the opacity here with our color shader to get what we need here. I ended up having to dial in the color shader just for this fall off, just to make sure there was like enough of a blend there as this travels along, but not too much to where it ends up kind of like intruding into the composition in a way that I wasn't looking for. So from there, we start to dive into our padding. And the outer padding that I wanted to have here was this off-white leather that felt like it blended in nicely with our other materials and kind of pulls from the same color space as our inner dots, just to kind of make everything feel cohesive here. So for our inner padding, essentially using the same material, just a variation on that, and having a kind of different colored leather within the center. And so a more salmon pinkish leather inside that is housing our sphere and really giving it the treatment its fragility deserves. So from there, I ended up playing around with the threading and explored a couple different looks for this. But what ended up kind of working the best was using the same cream color to blend in and feel at home with everything else. The stitching, again, feels nice as it kind of pulls along when the sphere travels. It feels like it actually has some elasticity. You get some intersections as this kind of travels along, which is kind of just the nature of the beast with this. You can spend some time to really tweak that and make sure to minimize that as much as possible. For this specific motion test shot, it wasn't bothering me too much. And again, it's kind of the case of spending the time to dial this in as the project develops, and if this specific shot moves forward, really giving it some additional love and making sure it really shines. All right, and next thing here was starting to add texturing for our threading and our beads, and essentially just grabbed a copper metal texture here. The only thing that's unique about this is I ended up actually fracturing out these beads. So essentially the same as we've done with previous techniques, but I fractured it out to be able to drive color much similarly in the same way that we did this upper layer cloth. And so blending between the copper and just the regular threading shader here. So it just makes it to where I can kind of dial in these beads. So as they travel underneath the cloth, they shift their material, and it just made it a lot less busy. And again, focused your eye. I think throughout all this kind of look development and taking the time to do different explorations, it's kind of keeping one eye on the overarching top line concept and the overarching direction. So kind of gut checking everything in terms of that is definitely helpful along the way. And essentially that was my first exploration with our colorway, and I ended up adding in some GSG dust just to add a nice kind of tactility and try to ground it as much as possible. It's really subtle, but it adds a nice additional touch as well. And from here, again, I started to explore a few different colorways, and we can take a look quickly at where we landed with those. And here we have the 3 colorways that I ended up exploring, and along the way kind of landed on some unique different looks for perhaps different aspects of the product line. And since we have this scene file set up as a perfect loop, just gives us a good case to be able to sync these up all together. And this is the point in the process where take some time to reflect back on some of the more useful insights that we gained throughout trying to establish and develop this specific shot, and then revisit some of the previous more successful style frames and start work on perhaps an additional motion test, or incorporate a lot of the lessons learned going down this specific pathway and fold that back in to some of our additional design thinking and development. And along this process of exploration and development, you really want to keep it loose and keep it open and narrow in as you progress. Keeping an open mind and kind of allowing yourself to go down different pathways and then circle back in terms of the top line concept is really important, because your research and development phase is the time that you devote and allow yourself to venture outside of the box and discover some unexpected avenues that you wouldn't initially find just from diving straight in and going down a specific route. A lot of this ends up being kind of reverse engineering along the way, and there is something to be said for allowing yourself to think more dynamically and be more flexible in that regard, rather than trying to forward engineer everything and take the straight path. Your concept is king, but really don't limit yourself in how you are able to tie back to the concept. With procedural workflows especially, it's really about working smarter and not harder, and saving the hard work for where it really matters. You can offload as much of the menial and redundant tasks as possible that you don't need to spend your time doing, and really letting the computer do what it does best so you can do what you do better. Everything that you are able to free up that isn't necessarily the best use of your time is time that you can devote to another aspect and be more efficient and more effective in your process. I think it's really important to allow yourself to be detail-oriented while also retaining this higher level design thinking and keeping your eye on the big picture. This ends up being a balancing act between kind of macro and micro focus, and sometimes that helps yourself keep a fresh perspective from shifting back and forth between those different focus points. Delineating and dividing tasks accordingly to those different focuses can really help you know where to place your time, and shifting back and forth between those can help you always refer back to the top line and the overarching concept. Overall, I hope this helps begin shifting your mindset towards working more procedurally and adopting more procedural practices and approaches when working within Cinema 4D. And hopefully, down the line, also inspires you to adopt more procedural-based software as well. But thank you so much for joining me along the way throughout this course. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions or just to drop a line and say hello through any of my various avenues. But until then, thanks again and take care. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this peripheral lesson on project setup. Just wanted to take some time to generally get everything kicked off on the right foot in terms of best practices for folder structure, file naming conventions, and settings within Cinema 4D. So first off, in terms of folder structure, this is generally the folder structure format that I utilize in my personal projects. It's slightly different than the one that I use at work, but for this it works fairly well in terms of smaller scale projects with perhaps one or a couple people on board. First off here, just having everything organized nicely in the proper order will just save a lot of headaches down the line in terms of setting up your render paths and getting everything exactly where it needs to be. The first folder here for documents is generally documents provided by the client, whether that's kickoff files for the brief that they have supplied. It could also just be kind of general documents that you would need in terms of invoicing or any documents that you'd be providing to the client. The second one here is pretty straightforward, just reference folder. Usually within that we'll have subfolders for different types of reference, if it's a specific concept that I'm pulling reference for or what have you. The third folder here is for assets, and within that I generally would have client-supplied assets and then perhaps gathered general assets. So client-supplied assets could be anything from specific vector logo files that they provide, CAD files, whatever the case may be. And then general assets are things that I've either prepared myself or gathered that I'll need to utilize throughout the project. The design folder generally just have a variety of my design explorations. I'll often have two subfolders for specific kind of design buckets that I'm working within. Right now, just kind of keeping it simple with keeping this at the base root. But generally, it's also a good idea to have subfolders for each specific design bucket that you're working within. And then within that, you can actually have, specific folders for Cinema 4D, for After Effects, for Houdini, whatever you may need. The next folder here, again, pretty straightforward, is just any general decks that I will be creating throughout the project, client-supplied decks, kind of internal decks that I'm working on. It's usually the case of throughout the projects a variety of pitch decks, development decks, and this can house all of those here. Next folder here is for production, and after we have moved out of the design phase and I have a list of specific shots that I need to move into production, those will get transferred over into here just to generally kind of clean up the design space. And once everything is moving forward, you're able to kind of pull everything into there and have one cohesive space that can house all your shots and everything in production throughout the project. Next folder is just renders folder. We'll briefly talk about how to point towards this so we can get all our renders working into there, which is nice. And finals is pretty straightforward, just any final files after the project is completed. So that is my general folder structure. You can use it however you may like, and obviously adapt it to your needs as well. For file naming conventions, this is the kind of file naming that generally works for me. This is for if I was running a project solo, so not actually needing to differentiate between who is working on which shot. And this is having a code at the beginning. So I just have GSG PS for procedural systems. And I usually incorporate a section that can talk about what phase of the project or what specific thing I'm working on. So there'll be look dev, motion test, anything that can help kind of differentiate what specific aspect of the project that I'm working on. And then now just have example, but that would be your file name specifically, and then iterate up from there. Having file naming convention that works throughout your entire project is really important, because then it just keeps everything super organized. You know exactly where everything is, and this file naming convention applies to everything across the board. If I'm developing assets, if I'm working on decks or whatever the case may be, renders as well, keeping within that file naming convention is super important. So jumping into cinema, this is the kind of point in the project where I would maybe develop a kind of base scene file that I can propagate throughout. And so when I'm working on the project, I have everything kind of set up the way that I need it each time I start a new scene. And that is where you can set this and then save this as your new .c4d in your programs folder. And then each time that you start a new scene file, it'll keep all those settings for you, which is super helpful. So first off, I generally kind of have a similar structure for a lot of my scenes, and I want to keep this loose enough to where it's adaptable for each, but maybe it's a good idea to at least start everything on the right foot with having nulls that can organize all your different layers. So these are kind of the three base ones that I always have, and then it's dependent outside of that on each individual scene. But here I have this very complicated scene of 3 spheres here, and then a camera, and then this is where I would generally have lights and psychs and anything else that I would need for the environment. We are using Octane Render for the project, and while it's not the most robust in terms of production features or stability, it is a good render engine to utilize for quick style frames and motion tests, and generally just more kind of straightforward scenes and really quick look development as well. And pulling up our Octane settings here, you'll see everything's pretty straightforward. I want to kind of get rid of a lot of the things that Octane will try to influence in your render. So you'll see I killed all the vignetting, no post going on. And for our response, just going to make sure that that is linear with our 2.2 gamma as well. Everything else, again, is dependent on your personal scene file. So for this case, I just kind of have some lower depth values, and we'll optimize those dependent on each scene. Now, looking over here at our specific render settings, first thing to note is, again, I want to set up a global scene file with global render settings that I can use throughout the project. And usually I'll save over that new .c4d per project if there's unique settings that I need that I know that I want global across the board. In this case, for our general render settings, we can get these all set up and not have to worry about it down the line. So one thing that is super useful about this is if you've ever used the take system, which I hope you have because it's extremely useful, you can do similar things with our render settings. So if you know within takes, once you create a general take, you can create a child take, and you can do the same thing with our render settings. So here I have HD animation. You can actually create a child take. So in this case, I want an HD still, and then any of these settings will inherit the parent take, except for the ones that you override. So in this case, for the still, I had just overridden the parent setting for frame range and changed it from all frames just to current frames. So I can have that still, but you can do this for any of your settings. So I have a hardware play blast here for when I just need to kick out different play blasts, and it'll inherit all the save settings and everything else. But then I just switched the render and adjusted everything else that I needed. So it's just super quick and super useful to be able to, if down the line, if you need to make a change to one of these settings, and everything else will just propagate to the children below, which is great. So for the still, we can take a look at Octane render settings that I'm using here. I try to get as much done possible in render. So again, it's kind of a case-by-case basis for which specific AOVs I'm kicking out. But one that I generally always use, because it's very useful when just doing color correction and post, is getting different object mats. So with this scene file, I just set that up as a baseline, and then for each scene, if I need specific AOVs kicked out, I can change those as well. But I have this set up to basically kick out different IDs based on these here. And this is set to the same path that I have for my save. And this is one useful thing to note, is now that we have our folder structure set up and everything is universal in this regard, it means that anytime that I copy this folder structure, and if I'm using the same folder structure every time, then I can keep these render settings the same because it's going to reference the folder structure here. So what I have set up here is it's really straightforward. It's just these two dots are essentially saying this is the current folder. It's going up one folder. So if we're in our design space here, this is where the Cinema 4D file is. It's going to say, here's this folder. We're going to go up one, and then we're going to go into 07_renders, which is this here. And then from there, we're going to create a folder called project. So we'll just take our project name here, and you can get a list of all these tokens on this side as well. I generally just use project and camera, sometimes current frame. So it is going to dive up a folder, go back into our renders folder, create a folder called project. So it'll create this file name here, then create another folder within there called project_camera. So it's going to take this camera name, which I currently have named as cam wide main, and then within there, save out all the frames using project and camera again. And so why I have these double ones is you'll see once I render here, but I just want to create one overarching folder, and then within there I can have folders for each camera. So if I'm kicking out multiple different shots in different cameras, then I have these all organized within one overarching project, which is super useful. So for our render passes, I'm using that same render pass, also rendering EXR at 32-bit. You can do a multi-layer file. I generally, just because After Effects, I do a lot of comping in After Effects, and it's really slow with their extractor to extract a multi-layer EXR. So I generally, especially when I'm only kicking out a couple different passes here, I'll do folders for those. Obviously, it increases exponentially in terms of how many different files you're going to have. So maybe you do multi-layer. It's kind of dependent on what your preference is, but it'll create folders for each of those. And then currently I just have an ID, which is for each of these. So just as an example. So let's hit render here, and I can show you why this is so useful. Let this render wildly high number of samples for the scene here. But so we had our design. It came out one level, dropped into our renders folder, created a folder with the name of our scene, created another folder with the name of our scene and our camera. And then within there, we have a scene with the name of our project, the name of our camera, and then folders for each of those mats. So I have one for each of the spheres. And again, this is going to be global if you're utilizing this folder structure for all of your projects. So you just have to set this up once, and then it'll propagate throughout the board, which is really awesome and definitely a time saver. But that is overall kind of my general settings that I utilize. It's primarily just taking the time to set up this scene file because, down the line when you have, tens or hundreds of different scenes and they all kind of have maybe a file that you hadn't necessarily taken the time to set up properly, then that just exponentially causes more time and more headaches. Yeah, hope this was helpful, and thanks for watching.